about 30 people listening to us bickering right now.
Okay, fantastic.
Well,
okay.
Speak into the
You
microphone.
don't need to. He doesn't use it.
He's gonna use it.
Well, I bet he won't.
Well, he can't now because you're not speaking into it.
Dude, just put
Enough
your
being
headphones on.
different.
Use
I'll
the
use
mic.
this instead.
There you go.
Okay, definitely use the microphone though. He said one time he didn't use it.
Really sorry about that.
It's not one
folks.
time.
Oh well.
I told you it's every
Very
time.
He's gonna use it this time, so it doesn't matter.
I'm using the mics. I'm using the mics
Ah.
because it's just you three.
Are we ready?
Yeah, you're good.
Ready, okay.
Being official
Things
on this.
going.
Okay.
For all of our live listeners, getting a nice peek into the team dynamic.
Yes. Teamwork. Kabuki strength teamwork. Is that in front of the camera for you? Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
All right. Welcome to Strength Chat with your host, the mad scientist of strength. Yes, that's right. Myself, Chris Duffin. To my left, the one, the only, the wizard of training, Mr. Brandon Sen. And to my right, the mysterious Brady Cable, who wants to be the skinniest man to ever pull 800 pounds.
The skinniest man ever.
Yeah, well, you know,
Correct that.
the other
Hey, why do you have your headphones on, Brady?
I thought we were going back to that.
the other day I walked out, speaking of being skinny, you know, and handling weights, the other day I walked out on the floor and the team was all gathered around. It was, you know, our production manager, Brandon, Brady, they're all sitting there chatting and lifting weights, and Brady's doing rear delt flies. And if anybody follows my training, they know I love back work. It's foundation, I think. Heavy bent over rows, heavy rear delt flies, and my mentee, Mr. Brady Cable, who I've just coached recently on bent over rows and not being a puss, was out there. What were you doing, Brady?
May have been using the 12s on my rear delt flies.
12 pounders. 12 pounders.
I was trying to get good scapular movement. Brandon's always harassing me for my shoulder blades not moving.
I don't think you're gonna deadlift 800 pounds doing.
You're right, and you adequately harassed me on that, and I think I've added about 25% to all my back work ever since that day.
Okay, all right.
I've started trying a little more on that.
And speaking of that, you know, it's just not my observation. The other day we hired this consultant to come in. Yes. And outside business consultant, you know, nice guy, but definitely not a lifter. Little skinny dude. And I mean, within 5 minutes of being in the room, I was harassing Andre, our creative director, about his, he's been dieting a little too long and, well, not lifting weights. And I was commenting about, yeah, something derogatory towards him. And our business consultant turns to Brady and says, I didn't think he was the skinniest one here. And he points directly at Brady. Look at him, look at him. So,
It's disgusting.
oh, by the way, welcome to Strength Chat, Brady.
In my defense, Andre was wearing a skin-tight medium polo, and I was wearing a baggy sweatshirt.
I've got nothing.
I don't think nothing needs to be had. I think we should actually get rolling with questions. Welcome to Strength Chat, Brady. And yeah, maybe you should join us more frequently. You wouldn't get harassed as much. But you know.
I don't know about that. That's kind of the way of things here.
So we're doing Q&A today. We're also live on Instagram, I believe. So we've got a number of questions to go through, and we're not going to make it through all of them. We're going to pick some ones that provide some good discussion and try to dive into them. So first question, how do you come back to deadlifting or squatting from a lower back tweak? So I'm going to point some people towards some existing content around this, and then we'll discuss kind of a little bit further as a team. But Brian Carroll and I have it's about a 20-minute, 30-minute discussion on my YouTube channel where we talk about, it's actually specifically around like the reverse hyper. That's the start of the discussion, is people using that tool are thinking it's a all-purpose fix-all for the back. But what we spend the majority of the time in the course of that podcast is actually discussing this topic. So particularly around you know, what exercises and approach to more of like back rehab. So a little bit more on like returning to squatting and deadlifting after a back injury. I think the biggest miss that I see is people not really diving in and understanding the reason behind the issue to begin with. The quality, you know, their setup, the quality of movement, these sorts of things. It gets to, you know, people focus around the rehab piece and trying to get back and never really address or assess like what put them there. And I see it constantly. I mean, people come to us and we'll look at it and like, oh, are you, oh yeah, I'm a member of kabuki.ms. I follow all the bracing methods. I do this, that, and then we'll watch a video and it's very clear that that isn't the case. Either that or they don't really understand all of that, and we see a lot of misses there. So that's the biggest thing, is really understand, like, there's a reason. It wasn't an accident, like a car came out of the sideways and hit you. Like, you injured yourself wall lifting. So there's either two things. You're pushing yourself too hard and accumulating too much fatigue, but still, why is it going into the back? Why is that the area that, because I'm guessing if you've got a tweak, you've probably done it before as well. Maybe another time before that. Or if you haven't tweaked it, do you have low back fatigue, pain? It takes me a few days to recover. My back's sore, but it's never been an injury, but it's sore. Then it gets better. And you just, we hear so many people say that you expect it's the norm, and you don't think about the fact that that shouldn't be the case. Because when, I'll give some examples. When I'm deadlifting heavy, and Brandon knows this, managing my training programs, when I'm up there pulling 800, 900 plus on a regular 2 or 3 times a week basis, I don't have low back pain. I don't have low back fatigue. Okay? That's conventional or sumo. Now, when I was a 600-pound deadlifter, or even a 550-pound deadlifter, almost 2 decades ago, I had low back fatigue all the time. I hated thinking about a long drive. I'd get hot packs in my car. I'd have to take breaks. I'd have to recline and make sure I got lumbar support and all this sorts of stuff. It would be it could be excruciating at times. Yet now I can do 30 or 40% more at a frequency. Back then I was deadlifting like once a week, or heavy once every other or third week, and that's the difference, is the quality of movement and really understanding that piece. You guys want to add any more specifics on that, or thoughts on? I kind of rambled for a bit, but
I think that pretty much covers it. I think outside of that too, you gotta know where your capacity is as a lifter, and just because you can physically do more work doesn't mean that you should really be allowed to. It's almost like you have to earn the right to do more training and have the capacity to recover from said training.
And any of those heavy movements, where we talked on this a recent podcast with Mike Israetel around axial loading, and the recovery aspect is much greater from that. Anything where we're actually loading the spine, so we've got a deadlift or squat. That you may need, if you need more volume, to look at other mechanisms for getting that volume that aren't loading you in that manner, or overloading. This is another thing, like maybe you are doing tons of heavy bent over rows and other movements where you're in you've got some shear loading forces or potential flexion or whatever it is in your training program, and we need to look at pulling those out. We're not huge proponents of conjugate training or West Side, but I remember one thing from when I used to follow that method a long time ago was Louis always proponed supported movements, because they did so much. They did so much, speed work, maxing out all the time, all this sort of stuff. So anytime that they were doing, back work, they were doing supportive movements. Clearly, I don't follow that or recommend that, but it's that thought process of how do I get that extra volume if I'm already pushing that to the max.
Yeah, you definitely have to check your training volume. It went from deadlifting 1 time a week to deadlifting 3 times a week. That could definitely cause a back tweak, but also looking at ways, like Chris was talking about, that you can handle that sort of volume. If your movement quality is poor, you're going to be placing more stress in specific areas, like your back, if you're losing mechanics there, etc.
So a couple other resources, The Gift of Injury, which you can find on our store. It's actually back in stock today, by Dr. Stuart McGill and Brian Carroll. Absolutely fabulous book, and I think one of the best books out there for an athlete dealing with those issues. We have a tremendous resource where we talk through actually the movement quality corrective patterns, all this sort of stuff to refine that and help you figure out. Because a lot of times, if you're thinking you have it figured out, you need another set of eyes, or you need to, you need some to improve your introspection and seeing the videos. We also talk through the setup on both the squat and deadlift, which gets you in an, that maximally stacked position and able to maintain it through the lift. So you can check out that on www.kabuki.ns. That link will continue to work even though we are currently migrating that site to Kabuki Strength / virtual coaching. Is that correct, Brandon?
Coaching.
Coaching. / coaching.
Used to be virtual coaching.
Okay. I like that. Okay. So, tremendous resource. I really, really recommend that you walk that. We've got guided tutorials on there. Anyway, that's a go-to place for that. All right. Brandon, you got a question you want to pick?
Sure. All right, I'll hit this one because I feel like we have some specific things that we can talk about on it. So the guy says he's 6'5", training should be different than average. I've spent a long time, 8 years, I don't know what that means, for 75 pounds. Working on mainly my squat, seems like nothing ever happens. Any thoughts on training a tall lifter? I thought I was asking you guys.
No.
No.
Question going off.
Yeah, sure. I'll
You go,
answer
and we'll roll with anything that we've got to add.
All right. Well, it depends if you are a strength athlete or not. If you are a strength athlete, unfortunately, you are confined to the competition-style squat, competition-style deadlift to be done to a full range of motion, which is going to be breaking parallel and pulling from however high a deadlift is.
Hey, don't forget to speak into the mic, we are recording via
We're not
the mic.
recording this. I promise he won't use it. You know why? It's more work.
No.
Promise.
I
promise. You'll see. Anyway.
No, he's going to do it now. You're forcing the situation because you're, now you're speaking to the side of the mic. I see. Anyway.
Well, the mic is over here, so. As a taller athlete, if you are a strength athlete, unfortunately, you're kind of stuck. I think the majority of your training should be done in things that do not compromise your big fundamentals in terms of spinal mechanics and probably foot and ankle function at that point. So with that considered, working on actual musculature than axial loaded movements is probably where I would start. If you're not a strength athlete, which it's a little unclear in the comment, I would spend more time in partial ranges of motion. There's not really any reason that we have to do things, from the floor at the height that plates are built at, other than they're just standardized that way.
They just happen to be 9 inches off the floor, and for bigger dudes, a lot of times that puts you in a compromised position. So
yeah, so block deadlifts are going to be very good. Squatting, probably less volume, but it's very independent. But if you're a strength athlete, you're kind of stuck, and I would work on building your actual musculature via other means and spending minimal time in the competition movements.
yeah, I think that's something a lot of people, we always, discuss full range of movements, the value of those, and we've got set parameters around, what is a good lift, but a lot of that is reference to the sport of powerlifting. If you're not a power lifter, it doesn't, and your biomechanics don't allow you to be in those great positions. There's nothing magical about a squat that's 1 inch deeper versus not, or again pulling off the floor, which is a big one. Usually most people have no issue. Most people don't have an issue hitting depth on a squat. But pulling off the floor can be a challenge if you're taller, if you don't have the longer arms. Some people that are taller don't have an issue, so just be aware, change those factors. Again, if you're training for the sport of powerlifting, you've got to do it. So
yeah, I think this question could use a little bit more context, but my advice would be to try the things that you haven't explored already. If you're 6'5", something that's going to pay off a lot is, like Brandon said, adding muscle. For a lot of taller, longer, leaner individuals, that's going to do something that'll greatly help you improve your leverages over time is getting a little bit bigger, having more muscle on your frame. If you've got a 6'5" body, you can support a lot of muscle generally. The other thing would be working on your technique to improve your leverages. Don't always just assume I'm 6'5", so I'm tall, so my squat leverages suck. There might be plenty of really low-hanging fruit technique-wise that you can use to make it a lot easier.
That's a really good point, Brady, because I see that a lot of times where people just get this set in their belief that this is what I can or can't do based on what they've tried before, and really, you got to get back to ground zero and walking through kind of the same discussion I just had, right? But I see that a lot, like, oh, I can't go to this depth because my hip mobility just doesn't allow it, and it's always going to pull me into flexion. Well, we spend 5 minutes working on bracing, and all of a sudden somebody that's never been able to hit depth for the last 10 years can do it just fine. There's other tools of changing it too. So the transformer bar is a great example where we can move that load out in front of the hip just like you would a goblet squat per se, and all of a sudden that allows you this upright torso position because of where the center of gravity of the weight is in reference to the hip. And so you can stay in this really stacked position, that stacked torso on top of the hip position, and squat much deeper than you normally would by changing the implement. So that can be absolutely a tremendous tool. And also think about back to the last question on the returning to squatting and deadlifting from a back injury or tweak. This can help you get that pattern down, and one of the reasons that Dr. Stu McGill, who I just referenced, who wrote the Back Mechanic, is a huge fan of the transformer bar itself because of its ability to do that. It's the only bar out there that will allow you to do that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that do ascribe being tall to just not being able to hit depth in the squat, but I see a ton of people of all different heights just overextending right away in their squat. Yeah. And tilting their pelvis forward, relying on their erectors for stability, and that's going to limit how much depth you can get out of it. So like Chris was saying, you improve intra-abdominal pressure and spinal mechanics, suddenly your hips work better and you can actually squat below parallel. And
somebody with that is taller, if they're doing just what you're saying, extending at the chest and rotating at the pelvis, we're going to see that issue come into play a lot harder and faster than you would a shorter person, which again make you think that I can't do this when we got to just get back to basics and retool those squat patterns.
Yeah, and this kind of covers quite a few questions that I saw posted, but just trying to maximize your leverage. There's a million things you can change to try and work to get better leverage, or work your leverages to be more advantageous for what they are. You can try squatting with more of a forward lean, less of a forward lean, more knees forward, lifted shoes, flat shoes. There's a ton of stuff you can change. Looking at spinal mechanics first, looking at rooting and foot engagement after that, just try to optimize everything.
Yeah, stance width.
Yeah, that's an easy one too. Toes out versus feet straighter. Always play around with that stuff and try and find what works best for you.
All right, Brady, question for you?
Yeah, and actually that kind of leads into the question that I wanted to talk about. And this person specifically addressed you two, but we'll go ahead and answer this one. So, asked about opinion on what the correct muscles are to use while squatting, and they just listed the quads and hamstrings. And I think that's kind of a thing that's become very polarized, and I don't know why the answer wouldn't be use as much of both as possible. There seems to be kind of the West Side-esque camp, or the gear lifter camp, of try to use just your glutes and hamstrings to squat and sitting as far back as possible. And there seems to be more people kind of on the Olympic weightlifting side that are squatting extremely upright with their knees going forward. They're trying to mostly use their quads. But with any squat, you're going to be using both. And how you're loading your hips and your quads is going to determine how much of those muscles you're using. But especially for the sport of powerlifting, where the goal is to produce as much force as possible, you want to use as much muscle as possible to do that. So again, going back to that conversation about optimizing your leverages to use as much musculature as possible.
Yeah, and Brady, aren't you working on that right now yourself?
100%.
So talk about your personal. What are you trying to do right now?
Yeah, I've been retooling my squat for like 2 years straight now, and I was, actually going back to the first question, I had a few different back tweaks squatting because I was squatting poorly. My intra-abdominal pressure wasn't good. Been working a ton on that. It's gotten a lot better. And then through the last about year or so, I was squatting in weightlifting shoes with a pretty moderate stance. I've always been able to squat extremely upright, and squatting in weightlifting shoes was just pushing my knees even further forward than they were already going. I have really mobile ankles. I just didn't need to be squatting in weightlifting shoes, and it was forcing me to use mostly my quads to do the lifting. So after talking with Chris and Brandon and a bunch of other people and constantly experimenting post my last competition, I've gone back to flat shoes, still have good amount of forward knee travel and no issues with depth, taking things a little bit wider, and my squat feels better than it has in forever. I feel like I'm actually using my glutes and just my hips in general when I squat now.
So my story is exactly the opposite, but it's tied to how the period of time where my squat really accelerated from 800 pounds into 900 in the 900 range and what I did. And so my background with geared lifting was also a very posterior dominant squat. That's what I did everything, and that's why I pulled so heavy, is because of the development in that. But I never used my quads to squat, and so I spent quite a bit of time. If you look back at my training, I spent entire blocks of training doing nothing but front squatting. There was a lot of work that didn't make it into videos because it was just belt squatting, but I would belt squat with heels elevated and in a close stance, and really keep the tension on my quads the entire time and never let it off. I did both of this for about a year, and then I really started to finally feel my quads in squatting as well. And then that's when, now that I had that one pattern down and I was progressing and I'd made a point, but I kind of leveled out. And then once I started getting more quad in as well, my squat started jumping up substantially. And so yeah, it's not one or the other, or one's right or not, but the more that you could use is better, right? So I'm 100% with Brady, and we're both looking at it from different perspectives and have improved doing that. But by doing that purposeful work to pattern the quad engagement into my squat, I added probably somewhere close to 100 pounds on my squat. Now, Brandon could turn and say, no, that's all because of my awesome programming, your coach brought all it. But again, that was a purposeful plan that we worked on, and the output was what it was. Like, it's in the numbers, so.
Yeah, that was part of what went into the program design, was trying to balance that out.
Exactly. Brandon, you got anything to add on that one?
Sure. The other half of that question, a couple other questions are on the topic of, should my hips go first, or should my knees get pushed forward more? Should I be focusing more on sitting back, or should I be focused on pushing my knees forward, as seems like has become popular recently? And it seems like, as Chris and Brady alluded to, the hips back was a thing that was really invented by the geared lifting community to take advantage of the lifting gear itself and get more stretch out of it. The knees forward has been something that is seen in weightlifting because it's impossible to catch a clean or a snatch if you are not completely upright. So we can't like, for lack of a better term, bastardize those two and think of them as two different techniques. They're squatting specifically for a purpose. Now, if you're a powerlifter, you should be hinging equally at your hips, knees, and ankles, and whatever your natural proportions allow, that's what your squat's going to look like. You shouldn't be focusing on any one thing.
You actually don't focus on those at all. You focus on spinal mechanics. I'm jumping in here, and foot mechanics. If you take care of those and do them properly, and we've got, again, tons of content around it, the knees, the travel forward is going to be what it is if we've got that balanced in midfoot. Sorry, jumping in there, Brandon.
That's right too. I didn't think about that.
Just, let's focus on that. A lot of people focus, is my knees far enough out? Are they caving in? Is it too far forward? Is it, that's an output. That's an output. And so if we manage and control the inputs, you're going to get there. But if you try to manage the output, you're not taking care of the things that are going to make you lift correctly, allow you to lift the most amount from a performance aspect, and also reduce your injury risk. So we've got to quit focusing on that and focus on the pieces that are driving it, and let that be what it is.
Yeah. Honestly, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. You're likely going to work through the same complete range of motion as you would. The only difference is if you're focusing excessively in one manner or the other, you may get a little more beat up, but At the end of the day, you just got to squat.
Exactly.
When coaching newer lifters, I almost never go to coaching what motion their hips or their knees are doing. I just get their intra-abdominal pressure and their foot mechanics down, and then just say squat, sit down, whatever.
Yep, same thing here. And it's amazing some of the differences you'll see on that output when you do that, but we don't focus on that. So, and cueing that is like, I believe, the worst thing that you can do.
Yeah. Because I mean, the less you can have somebody thinking about these extrinsic things, like what their knees are doing and what direction their knees are moving in a squat, the better. The more unconscious the movement can be, the more well they'll be able to execute it. Somebody, or that same person, asked a question about what kind of movement prep would be good for people to have that good morning type of squat where their hips are shifting back. You know, a lot of that can be just the mechanics of the lift and how they're loading on the way down, but just work on your ankles to allow your ankles to move forward a little bit, or your knees to move forward a little bit more could be helpful. Kind of depends on what's causing that to begin with, though, with the individual.
I think it's my turn for a question. I see you trying to jump in here.
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm going to give you, it's a gimme, I think this is a gimme question here, but hey, I'm interested in velocity-based training with the device. Can you share how I can start building a profile and how I can implement in my workout regimen? Basically, one-on-one on how to get started. So, I'm going to start with resources. So Brandon here has got a fabulous article which covers some VBT stuff and just auto-regulation as a whole, and it's titled the Auto-Regulation Book of Methods, which you can find on kabukistrength.com. And it includes a free downloadable velocity profiling tool. And so for those not familiar with what we're doing here, we look at velocity not for trying to get faster. So traditionally a lot of people think of velocity-based training as doing their speed training or trying to improve velocity. We think of velocity as effort-based training, and we use it for all of our core lifts for the heavy work that we do. And so we generate a velocity profile. It's a one-time session. This isn't a, you know, you work this one, so it's not something that takes weeks to do or anything like that. And correct me if I'm misspeaking. You're just laughing at something else.
Oh, I was reading comments on the live feed.
Okay. So this is something that you do, and it basically correlates, you know, across we create a, you know, a fancy term, linear regression line. But basically at 80%, we know your velocity is this, 85%, 90%, so on. So you've got this profile, and so that's the starting point. And it's a one-time session. It's a downloadable tool that you can do. And then if you're doing your own work, all you've got to do now is just take those. If you're using you know, classical periodization, for example, is you're going to replace percentages with the velocity, with the corresponding velocity. And so now that allows you to, if you've got this you know, plan, let's say you've got some, you know, template plan, it's a periodization plan that you've developed or borrowed or whatever it is, that plan will now shift with you, whether you're progressing faster to plan, on plan, or perhaps, you know, behind plan, whichever it is going to be, it's going to follow with you, and you'll be able to take advantage of everything, every opportunity in it, because maybe the plan has you developing to 7%, you know, increasing your squat by 7% over this, you know, 3-month block. Well, maybe it's 8%, maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 5%. So if you'd followed the plan, if it was 5%, you would have beat yourself up a little too much, potentially been in a risk for injury, and probably not realized even the 5% because you would have been too beat up from trying to push it too hard. But usually we find it's the opposite. We find that you know, you might have had 10% in there, and you didn't take the opportunity of it because you followed the numbers of the plan. So, and week to week, it's going to shift with you based on, because progression is not linear. You know, it's an upward trend, but it's constantly working in waves. And so now your plan is going to match that and capture every opportunity along the way. I probably should have just asked this of these two guys, so you guys let me know where I screwed up there, or anything else that you want to add on there.
I think that probably about covers it, really. The only thing I would add is when, specifically when you're getting started, you don't have to jump right into managing your training loads with velocity, and I would recommend just monitoring your velocity and recording it, depending on the device you're using. But if you can record your velocity week to week, then you have a marker for progress that's not just training load. So it would otherwise be impossible for us to measure 2 to 3 to 4% improvements in improvement over the course of a week, a month, or whatever. So that's one of the biggest benefits of velocity, is to see those improvements happening without actually testing new 1 rep maxes. So highly encourage you to record first, and then secondly, 2 considerations that I would make to actually, if you're someone who should use velocity. Number 1, you have to be able to move well first. You can't have a lot of movement variability happening in your lifting. If you have a lot of movement variability happening, you're going to see that feedback on the device and may lead you to make poor decisions in training. For an example, if you're deadlifting and you start with your back rounded to accelerate the bar to lockout, the device is going to show that you move the bar very quickly, but with compromised mechanics, you're likely either going to limit your top end strength or leave yourself open to injury in that training session. So making sure that you move properly is number 1, and the second one is you actually have to try. So the fastest way to not make progress on a auto-regulation based program is to not put effort into it. And sure, everyone will likely think that they're trying, especially if you're just kind of doing the work, but it's certainly not the case. If you squat something slow one day, you have one of 2 options. You can either lower the weight, or you can decide to try and do it better on the next set. And generally everyone should bias towards doing it better or adding load, and reduce load only when absolutely needed. What do you think, Brady?
Yeah, you guys really comprehensively covered it. I don't know that I have anything to add.
Okay. So, Brandon, you're up next with questions.
My turn. Let me see.
Yeah, we could kill the time talking about Brady's 12-pounder hill flights in the interim while we
a slightly related question if we want to pass up Brandon real quick.
Okay.
This guy's asking about weight cutting with 2-hour weigh-ins, and I think this is big. Brandon and I have pretty opposite experiences that relate to this guy's question, and then you could probably chime in with some 24-hour weigh-in stories.
And I've helped a lot of people with some decent USAPL IPF lifters with weight cut strategies before. So
yeah, because it's all very much the same information, just to different degrees, it seems like.
Yep.
Yeah, so this guy's asking if it's better to maintain a lower body weight and body fat and then try to cut weight going into the meet. So what I've done for my last couple of meets is get up to a heavier weight in the off season and then kind of diet down really slowly through my meet prep, which I feel quite a bit stronger being 5 to 10 pounds over my weight class. And I can maintain that, but as I get right about to my weight class in the last few weeks leading into the meet, I definitely feel my recovery take a dip outside of just the normal, meet prep type stresses. So actually this next meet that I do, I'm going to experiment with doing a small water cut and just staying heavier going into it, which has kind of been Brandon's strategy for the last few. To me, it seems like the heavier you could be coming into your weight class, the more competitive and stronger you'll be. So, Brandon, maybe you can talk a little bit about your experience with that.
Generally, I cut weight before competitions because I'm too lazy to diet in the off season, and I enjoy the finer delicacies of Portland, Oregon.
The food is a problem. Did you know, by the way, that Salt and Straw this month is chocolate month? So. They've got all sorts of, going to be a Willy Wonka chocolate factory at the famous Salt and Straw ice cream. So getting off topic here, but I got plans.
I think that's more important.
Making a trip there on Saturday then.
So to kind of follow up on Brady's point, I don't really think it matters, honestly, either way, as long as you make weight and you're not cutting too much right before the competition. So if you get into a situation where you're like, oh, I have to cut 15% at a 2-hour weigh-in, then you will just disintegrate. It won't work. So I think if you keep that within 5 to 7%, you should see no issues with your strength whatsoever. So make sure that you're within range of that 5 to 7% for a 2-hour weigh-in. I think for a 24-hour weigh-in, it could be upwards of maybe 10 to 12%, but it really depends on the resources you have available to you in order to get the weight back on. Obviously, you can do other things in a 24-hour weigh-in that you can't in a 2-hour weigh-in, such as IV and eat more for a day, but I think it's not so much about how you get the weight off, as long as you're not sacrificing a ton right around the competition and competition day, but it's really about how you get it back on. And I think Chris and I have different opinions on this, but I am a very big proponent, especially for a 2-hour weigh-in, to go purely liquids in the morning with a lot of salt and carbohydrates in there. And it might be different for a 24-hour weigh-in though. What do you think? Chris
yeah,
has
so
the most
I'll go for a little while. So you actually just hit a really important topic, which was kind of related to stress. I missed what you were saying there for a second, or I don't remember it.
You're thinking about chocolate?
I'm still thinking about chocolate. So I might have checked out the chocolate offerings in San Diego and LA locations of salt and straw as well. So I don't know. Is it terrible if I did a trip just for ice cream?
No.
Yeah, probably. So anyway, that is tied to weight cutting though. So you know, the weight cut takes a toll on you. And there was another question earlier about, you know, stress management prior to a meet. Yeah, everything feeds in. And so the level of stress that the cutting and recomping adds to you is going to take something off of you as well. It all comes, the body doesn't know the difference in resources. Now, I do have a really good article around weight cutting that covers cutting in the 5 to 7% range, actually. That's on our website. I'm sure if you just type Duffin weight cutting into Google, it'll pop up for you. So, a couple things that I want to hit on here is I really preference whether you're cutting or not, like doing the long-term cutting or the short-term cutting, that you get to your desired weight pre water loss 3 to 4 weeks out from a meet, and maybe it's less. The point is you want to be there while you're in the phase where you're doing things that are helping you determine what your lifts are going to be, because regardless if it's fat loss, it changes your leverages and it's going to change how you lift, and all of a sudden showing up on meet day and everything's moving and feeling different is not a good thing. So you need to be there at least early enough that you've got some of your critical pre-meet lifts in so you can really get that dialed in. It seems minor, but this is important, okay? Another thing, Brandon, we've kind of talked about this before, when doing the water cutting. So I'm not sure if I covered this in the article or not. I believe I did, but sometimes people miss it because it's just a minor detail. Is you want to, in addition to, you know, some salt loading phases, which I go through in the article, but anytime you're in that water loading, you need to add a multi-mineral supplement in. Yeah, see, Brandon's over here nodding yes, because if you don't, you're just going to be depleted. All of a sudden, you're just going to feel just like lethargic, like your legs will feel dead under you. Because you've got so much water going through it, stripping all that stuff away. So it's really important to manage that. But the intricacies I've covered in that piece as far as timing of nutrients, and it's pretty thorough. But those are some of the big points I think that really need to be, like, don't forget these. Like, be at a weight so you can get your test lifts in. Either strategy that you're using. I believe a small water cut and then a successful recomp can be beneficial, because as long as you're not putting in a high degree of stress on the body or the mind, as long as you're not putting in a high degree of stress of any of those, you will have a little bit of a super compensation effect. So if I cut 3 pounds, I might bounce back 5. Okay, that's what we want to. That's what we want to be shooting for during meet day. Like Brandon said, a lot of fluids. Electrolytes, you know, having some glucose tabs that you can pop like around lifting time can be really useful. These are things that we want to do. Also tied to this question I get a lot is meet day food strategy, and the biggest thing I can tell you there is stick with what you know. Okay, don't be trying something new or some different approach. No, you know what you're comfortable with and what's good. I mean, for me, I just like to, I can't, on a meet day, I've got a high level of anxiety and I can't hold down food very well. Like, it just doesn't, you know, the digestion isn't working well. So I stick with really basic stuff. Peanut butter and jelly is just a go-to for me. It doesn't cause me too much of a spike in my sugar levels that I'm going to crash from at the wrong time. It's not a whole lot of food, and I can have them intermittently like a snack instead of a meal during the day. If it's a big long meet, like one that's going to run into late night, and you've got big breaks, I'll do a meal. If I'm going to do a meal, everybody that follows me knows I love my burgers and my meats and all this. I avoid that stuff. I don't want something big and heavy waiting on me. I'm going to go with something a little lighter, maybe some chicken, something that's going to digest well, French fries, you know, things like that. Just what is going to sit well, what's not going to slow me down, and then a little bit is you know, related to how big the meat is and how fast it moves, and then staying on top of fluids through the day. Gatorade hasn't worked too well for me. Usually I'll do like a half and half mix with Pedialyte and water, kind of sipping on through the day, but not engorging, because again, that can cause a lot of sloshing in the belly. Then the food doesn't absorb, and you can also get again that crash from spiking those levels too much, and then it crashes later. So that's again why I kind of like having a little glucose tabs right around the training. That way I can make sure that I've got that energy level right when I need it and time it appropriately. And it's really easy to time because it's right then. So those are some of the stuff on nutritional strategies and weight cut. With 2-hour weigh-ins, you don't want to push it too hard, but I have let's see, I have coached some well-known USAPL lifters that have cut close to 10% body fat successfully on meet day. I wouldn't do that myself. Honestly, that's too much. But you know, some people have done that. So, but 5% is probably, like, to me, what I would say is maximal. Even Brandon cutting 7% is not something I personally would go for on a 2-hour weigh-in.
Not sure Brandon would personally go for that anymore either.
Exactly. I think Brandon's success there has been interesting.
I was successful.
So, well, you successfully cut weight, yes.
I hit a good squat.
And then
it was evacuating myself all day with no regard for anything else.
Who's up for picking a question this time?
Brandon.
I think it's me. So the question is thoughts on heavy holds for training, like a 110% bench press. How often should you do it? Thoughts on sets and reps, etc. So I have a few different thoughts on this. What we're talking about here is called post-activation potentiation. It's a very fancy term for saying we are tricking your body into thinking it's going to lift more before you actually do. I think one of the biggest benefits to this type of training is confidence more than anything, but it has been shown to be very effective for recruiting more muscle fiber at lower intensities. So in terms of implementation, there's quite a few different opinions on this. Brady and I did a podcast with Travis Mash. He is quite a big fan of using heavy walkouts for squats, holding it and then re-racking it. I haven't found that to be ultra beneficial. I haven't found it to be beneficial in the squat or the deadlift, but I have found it to be beneficial in the bench press. And I'm not quite sure why. I happen to think that it's because the bench press is a smaller range of motion, that you'll have less variability through the entire range of motion. So the load that you're holding at the top is somewhat similar to how you would be holding it at the bottom, albeit it's not completely the same, but the total range of motion is far less than a squat or a deadlift. Now in implementation, it's really important not to abuse this in your training. This should not be used as like your one trick to get that training, that set to feel better. The training effect from PAP work is like an hour. So outside of that, there's zero benefit that's going to be accumulated from that type of training. The only benefits are going to be in that training session from the training that precedes that heavy hold. So if you're doing this week on week on week, it's something that will diminish over time in terms of its effectiveness. So I'd be very strategic with where you implement it into the training plan. For some athletes, I've used it, like I said, purely as a confidence builder. It's not necessarily something that I believe would help, but some people get freaked out when they have to go squat heavy. So having them hold a heavier weight can somewhat reassure their monkey brain that they can do it. So in that sense, I would do it for confidence. But other than that, I found a lot of benefit into doing, and I don't even do a heavy hold. I actually have done either a heavy single or a heavy single with boards or bands in the bench press, followed by volume work. And I found that my volume work is almost always faster when measured on the velocity device, and we know that a faster load, so if we account for load and stabilize that, so 80% versus 80%, if you move 80% faster, you will stimulate more muscle fibers, so huge benefit there. I'm not a huge fan of doing it during heavy training. I think the stress accumulated in the heavy training is probably enough, but if it's a confidence thing, then there you go. I think the one way to misuse this is to do it too much, as I previously mentioned, or I would say too frequently or too much within the training session, so you turn this into an actual stressor. If you do a heavy hold, it should not be an additional stressor to your actual training. It should only be an added additive. So those are my thoughts.
Like my personal opinion, just from like the confidence perspective, is it's always a lot different walking out a squat than it is to actually move with that weight. So I am a little more partial towards, like you said, doing like a heavy bands or board or something. Mm-hmm. And I really like something Travis talked about in our podcast was then doing full range of motion work after that. So like doing some heavy 2 board sets, but then going down and doing volume work with straight weight. And going off of that too, just not being an ego lifter and using like heavy block pulls from above the knee to feel better.
Do people just like trolling the IG Live? Uh-huh. Provide some entertainment. Uh-huh. So,
well stated, Brady.
Yeah, whatever you said. Whatever you said.
Any thoughts on heavy holds, Chris?
Nah.
I was thinking about.
I've always done a little bit of mixture of. Gosh, I can't think of the word right now. But anyway, light band, either assistance or resisted, or chain that I like in those preparation, reverse band, or chain work mixed in, where I've got a pretty heavy difference between top to bottom in certain periods of my training and preparation for handling those heavier loads, so that when I get there, it doesn't just, you unrack over 900 pounds on your back. If you haven't done it before, it could be a pretty damn scary thing. So
feels like it's going to crush you.
Exactly. It's like going to go right through you. So it's something you've got to really build up. Next question. I'm up next, right? Okay.
Our last one. I think we're running up pretty late now.
We're getting there. Hi, sir. Are there any movements or exercises that can improve scoliosis? So, seems kind of like an odd question, but I've gotten this question a lot through the years. And before I answer, let me be clear. I am not a medical professional providing medical advice, and neither...
In your bio it says you're a scientist, though.
A mad one.
Oh.
And a scientist is not a medical professional, by the way, so just saying. So anyway, not a medical professional, neither are these gentlemen, but I have through the years either helped some people with this or talked to a lot of people that have had success using some of our methods and actually seen that. So I'm going to talk through some of the things that I would look at doing for scoliosis. Now, when I reference this, a lot of these I won't be able to describe the movement, so I'm going to list a movement that is on kabuki.ms. So sorry for that, but describing movement on a podcast usually doesn't get the case. So a lot of times I'm just looking for relieving stress along everything along the spine. So we're looking at tension around the scapula, thoracic, lumbar, and really making sure that we don't have any hypertonicity in those areas. So one of my favorite ones that I'd recommend is going to be an erector and diaphragm repatterning drill. This is on kabuki.ms, should be under that name, but it involves a couple AccuMobility balls under along the erectors, kind of in the thoracic TL junction area, and a weight in your hands and a little bit of a dead bug pressing type movement. Again, look it up. So that's going to be a really good movement for calming those areas down, and also improving the function of the diaphragm, which again I believe is going to have a huge, larger impact on that. Some other ones, Brady, I'm not sure what we call the drill, but we have the accumobility balls under the scapula, and we're actually moving and winging through a movement.
Angels.
Yes, so it's an angel with an accumobility ball under the scapula.
Yep.
Is a great movement there. I haven't done this one myself. Well, I've done this drill, but I haven't worked with anybody with scoliosis with this one. But I've heard several people with it or partners with it that have had good success laying the geisha roller lengthwise along the spine for long periods of time, creating a little bit of a lengthening effect with that weight. So just long periods of time with that heavy weight resting. It's basically going to be resting on the ass and between the shoulder blades is what we're looking for. And you're going to want to just relax and hang out and spend a fair bit of time with that one, probably longer than you would normally with any sort of that fall under Donnie Thompson's tempering that long static loading period. Another one, actually a good one, comes from Donnie, and I've got a video on this. It's an open video titled, it's on an article titled Hacking Hip Restrictions, but the hanging drill in there is going to be great. So it's you're hanging upside down via the hips in the bands and doing some movement about the hips. For the scoliosis, the movement about the hips may not be as important, just as much as the time of deloading that spine. But if you're there, you may as well do the movement as well. It's awesome for the hips and back. In my experience, that's actually my go-to movement prior to any deadlift or squatting session that I absolutely love. Either of you gentlemen have anything to add on that?
Yep. I think obviously find yourself a good physical therapist.
Yes.
And get working on that in terms of like a balancing and symmetry aspect. From the perspective of a strength coach, and the things that I would try to do working with somebody like that would be to just bring as much balance to everything as possible. And I don't mean that as in doing more stuff on one side. I mean just intent of uniformity, specifically through like bracing and intro.
Yeah, actually, that's one thing I forgot in there was really testing the left and right oblique inflation to make sure that they're inflating at the same time. So one isn't latent behind the other, or one isn't firing as hard when you get to the extents as well. If you got an imbalance there, that's really something to work on. The Okinawan strength technique, which again is a kabuki.ms video, is a really great self-correction that can be done on a daily basis to get that brought back together. But anytime we've got that, particularly in stabilization, is going to be, it's not necessarily the oblique pulling on the spine, but you're going to have that excess tension on one side of the body pulling over the other, which is, if you've already got scoliosis going on, not something that's going to be beneficial to have additive. And I'll reinforce Brady's point, like get with a professional and begin working through this as well. So
yeah, so doing that, I mean, sometimes there's a lot of low-hanging fruit just in like realizing that and thinking about pressurizing more on one side, because it's not as instinctive and you just naturally pressing more to one side. You just bringing awareness to that can sometimes bring about a lot of change. And that also answers quite a few, because I'm sure there's probably 8 of these questions in there about like, oh, my right psoas, my left glute, whatever. I feel more on one side than the other. My one side of me is, restricted, or one side of me works harder. Bringing as much balance as you can to your abdominals first, and working on getting good, even intra-abdominal pressure is going to help with the symmetry of loading through the rest of your body.
Brandon, anything to add?
Yeah, not from a rehab standpoint, but from a strength standpoint, definitely work on improving your spinal erectors and getting them to do their job of holding your spine up. Outside of that, bracing, all that, combining those two.
We got time for another question, or I think we're getting close on time here. So
it's been about an hour. If you want to do one more, we can.
Yeah, I think we started at 9:30, I believe. So we're about 50 minutes in. Okay. So I think we might got one more.
Anything jump out at either of you guys?
There's one on shoulder rock that I could do.
Is asking if it would be useful for hypertrophy.
Yeah. I think that's a good question. So can the shoulder rock be used for hypertrophy, or would the time under tension be too small? And is there a point to undulating usage of the shoulder rock during the week? It's a good question. So admittedly, yeah, the time under tension is low, and it wouldn't be like a go-to. Let's say, hey, I want to be building my rear delts. I'll do shoulder rock swings. So shoulder rock is definitely a strength training tool, though. And so it's going to be hitting all of those, but not really target any one area. Due to the lack of time under tension, if you want to have a hypertrophy effect, I would actually work on increasing the frequency, because your recovery time is going to be really minimal with it. But we've got to, much like an Olympic lifting, like snatching, to get the benefits, you've got to do it, almost on a daily basis to have that hypertrophy effect. You could look at some undulating training with some heavier days and lighter days. The only thing I would say is, if you're going to do that, make sure that on the heavier stuff you're still not breaking down. So it's really important that we're maintaining good movement quality during those. But I've had good effect and worked that in my training as well, doing just that. So, but first I would move towards doing higher frequency. The hypertrophy effect is going to take place on the entire growth. So you're affecting a lot of muscles at one time. So you're going to see a progressive effect on all of those, but not really a dramatic effect on any one area. Anything that you'd add on that, Brady?
So it seems like the short answer would be yes, it can, but it might not be the best tool for developing a like if you want bigger medial delts, it's not going to be the best tool for that.
Right.
But, yeah. The benefits are mostly in strength and then the just neurological firing of being able to turn muscles on and off.
Yep. Yeah, the effect around neurology is like the cornerstone of what makes the shoulder rock what it is, and why we see just unending success stories with people implementing it in their programming. All right,
Anthony, Brandon, otherwise I got one for you.
Sure, go ahead.
I was just going to say the peaking one at the very bottom, or singles one, sorry.
Oh, no, I didn't see that one. That looks like it was posted 4 minutes ago.
Yeah.
What is it? How often can singles be incorporated into a non-peaking strength phase? Again, I mean, anytime, like as much as you want, doesn't really matter. It really depends on the context of, what do you want to get out of your strength phase. I think you have to consider the next phase of training anytime you use singles, because anytime you use singles in training, it's kind of like lowering your load early. You kind of get the strongest training stimulus involved in the training process, when in reality probably doesn't need to be there. An example of that, a very practical example, in fact, with an athlete that I'm currently working with, Chris Bridgeford. He has a deadlift only competition coming up. During that time he hasn't really been squatting, and he's been doing a little bit of bench pressing, but later in the year in the next 2 to 3 months he has the US Open coming up. So how did we manage his deadlift training going up to the deadlift only competition? Well, because he was still making progress, we kept reps in his training the entire time. And then that leaves us room to actually incorporate singles later on in the year. So I would first make sure that you actually have to use singles in order to improve. Otherwise, it really depends. It depends on if you're a powerlifter or just a strength enthusiast. If you just kind of want to get strong, yeah, do as much as you want. If it's a non-peaking phase, though, I would assume that you are reserving quite a bit of volume in your training still. So the singles that you're using should probably not be that frequent, and they should probably not be that demanding. So maybe a one single at like a 90% or at like an 8 to 9 RPE followed by your volume work would be best suited. But outside of that, probably doesn't matter a ton. The only time I'd use it is if you are planning to transition into something else, though.
Okay. I think we're about ready to wrap it up.
Any closing thoughts, guys?
We had a really great questions today, and made for a really enjoyable discussion as a group. That's about all I've got to say.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay.
Brandon, any plugs?
Any plugs? Well, in fact, I do have plugs.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, tell us about your plug.
Let me caffeinate.
Okay.
For any of our listeners who don't know, we just launched a new website that's actually adjacent or a a subset of kabukistrength.com, and that is purely for our coaching services. Our education and Kabuki.ms will soon be migrated over there, so I would encourage you all to go to kabukistrength.com/coaching or virtualcoaching.net and check that out. Obviously, to access any of the videos that we've discussed today in terms of correcting scoliosis, muscular imbalances, prep work, go to kabuki.ms. Outside of that, that's all I got.
Okay, that sounds good. Thanks for joining us. Look forward to talking next time.